Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you to this webinar organized by the Belgian Foreign Trade Agency and its partners, the FPS Foreign Affairs, Flanders Investment and Trade, AWEX, and Hub Brussels. Today's webinar will focus on trade barriers and sanction regimes, with a special attention on the situation in Ukraine. We all witness that the language of trade is being disrupted again today. This time, the disruption is caused by a violent war, and this war is spiking inflation, especially in the cost of energy and food, which is slowly proving to be a scarier enemy than the Russian president. While this is happening, we need to look for solutions that clear out the path for an important process of change, and hopefully and ultimately come back to peace and a smoothly running multilateral trading system. We have a heavy agenda for the coming hours or so, but allow me to quickly brief you about a few practical aspects. First of all, the slides of the speakers will be made available. You will find them on our website. This webinar is recorded, and the recording is also available on our website. In case you have a specific question for a speaker, you can put it in the Q&A, mentioning the name of the speaker you address it to. If we don't have time to take all the questions, please send it by mail after the webinar. Last, this webinar will be held in French, Dutch, and English. Now, to kick off the webinar, may I introduce to you Madame Pascaline della Faille. She is the country and sector risk manager at Credendo, the export credit agency. One of Belgium's crown jewels, the reputation of the company is well known worldwide, and moreover, Credendo celebrates its 100th anniversary this year. So we know that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is provoking additional supply chain disruptions and a surge in commodity prices. This adds to the existing inflation pressure and deteriorates further the global financial conditions. The fallout from the war is also hampering the economy of countries with strong trade, financial, and migration links with Russia and Ukraine. Pascaline della Faille from Credendo is going to present the main fallout from the war in Ukraine and its impact on Credendo's cover policy on Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Traditionally, having a very strong presence in Eastern Europe and Russia, Credendo witnessed the fallout from the Ukraine crisis from a very close range. Pascaline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And let me share my screen with my presentation. So, as you said, the war in Ukraine has a huge impact on the world economy, not only in the region of the CIS, but also worldwide. And let me explain why. First, if we look at Ukraine and Russia, in terms of global GDP, the size is quite limited, but the impact of the sharp slowdown that is expected by the IMF in Russia, it's a growth decline of 8.5%, and for Ukraine it's more than 35%, has a huge impact, first of all, on all the trade partners of both countries. And among those countries, the biggest hit is on Belarus. You see on the slide that it is the one that is relying the most on export to Russia mainly, but also to Ukraine. It is followed by many countries in the region like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Moldova, but also by other countries in the Baltic. You see that on the slide you have Estonia, Latvia, for instance, and also some countries in Eastern Europe like Hungary and Poland. So that's really the first impact on a sharp contraction that is expected in terms of trade. Then another impact is also in terms of tourism. If you look at globally, again, they are quite country of relatively moderate size, but the tourism coming from Ukraine and Russia are very important for countries like Turkey, Egypt, Georgia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria, to name a few. Then when looking at the region, many countries in the region are highly reliant on remittances. So the remittances is really the money that is sent by migrants that are working, for instance, in Russia, and that sends the money back home. And there, of course, given the contraction of the GDP that we expect in Russia, the remittances that are going to be sent to the third country are likely to decline. The decline might be up to 30%. And there we see again that are the countries in the region that are the most hit by this expected decline. As you see in the graph, it's Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Moldova, Georgia, Uzbekistan that are likely to be the most hit. And then another impact is also for all the migrants that we see. And there on the short term, it is likely to add to the burden because you saw, as me, all the image of migrants going to Poland, Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, also some here in Belgium. But so the impact is really a negative impact on the short term, but on the long term, if you look at a country like Poland, they have not enough labor. And so it's likely also to have a positive impact, given that it will increase the labor force in the country that are welcoming all the migrants. So that's really the first impact that we see. It's more a regional one. Then the second impact is really the impact on risk aversion. With the invasion of Ukraine, we have seen a spike in risk aversion worldwide. And also it come along with an increase in inflation. The inflation was already on the rise last year, but this year with the increase in commodity prices, and I will come back to that in a few seconds, the inflation is further on the rise. You see here a graph where you see inflation for the Eurozone, the US, as well as in the gray bar is for Japan. And so the major central bank react. US started already to increase in interest rate. The ECB is expected to increase its interest rate in the coming weeks in June. And as a result, we see a sharp tightening of the global financial condition. If you look at the share price, for instance, they are clearly on the decline and under heavy pressure over the last months. If you look more globally, that means that whereas for many emerging markets, it was very easy over the past year to have access to the capital market, it is no longer the case. We see clearly a sharp decline in bond insurance, for instance, by emerging markets. What is the impact? The impact is, first of all, on the fact that many weaker issuer, for instance, being a sovereign or a corporate, don't have access to the capital market or has access at a very high price. And so it is adding to the pressure, but it's also an impact on the exchange rate. The exchange rate of some countries are under heavy pressure, which is also the case for the foreign exchange reserve. And if you look at foreign exchange reserve, when they are declining, it's put pressure on the liquidity. Of course, the most extreme case that we see for the moment is Sri Lanka, where the foreign exchange reserve have been declining very rapidly over the last months and years, and where exchange rates are also under heavy pressure, but it is not the only country. And of course, it raises a lot of question, because during the COVID crisis, in many countries, we have seen a further increase in public debt. The public debt last year was able to, many countries took the measure in order to decrease the public debt, but now the public debt are still very high level. And the question is really, what will be the impact on the fact that interest rates are on the rise? Many countries are likely not to be able to have access to the capital market. And so we may expect additional default worldwide. It comes on the top of the fact that commodity prices are surged rapidly since the beginning of the year. It is the case for energy prices, but also for metal and food prices. And that's really a source of concern, because if you look at commodity prices increase, of course, it is benefiting from all the commodity exporters. But for all the commodity importers, it's come with a huge cost. And if we look historically, clearly an increase in food price led to additional social unrest. For instance, you can think about the Arab Spring in 2011. It was partly driven by an increase in food prices. So that means that in the coming months of year, we can clearly see more social unrest, but it has also a huge impact on the public finance, and that's clearly a source of concern. And on the top of that, it is an additional burden for inflation, which is already very high, and we all feel it that inflation is high. And so when you have high inflation, apart from the risk that is related to the social unrest, you have also the fact that it's weighing on the consumer confidence, and due to that, we expect clearly a slowdown in the economic activity. When looking at short-term global economic indicator, you see in orange and red there the PMI business, the PMI indicator. When they are above 50, that means that you have an expansion, and below 50, it's a contraction that is expected. And here we see over the last months that clearly the confidence is decreasing, and that the PMI are also going closely to 50. They are still in the expanding category globally, but there again we see a deterioration. If you look at the black bar and the gray bar, that represent the trade volume and the business industrial production worldwide. It is on the right-hand scale, it's a growth there, and there we see also a sharp slowdown in industrial production and global trade. That's again a source of concern, because it comes on the top of sharp deterioration of consumer confidence. So we see clearly that whereas last year was very positive with sharp growth rebound and an increase in the activity, this year all the signals are more negative. It's come, of course, in a context of the war in Ukraine, but also the zero COVID policy in China. So, and on the top of that, when we look at the main risk, clearly we see the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine, that is a negative, a new negative shock in a difficult period, because we are with incomplete recovery, with large public and external debt, with weak economic fundamental in many countries. We see the rising inflation. Also the fact that the global financial conditions are deteriorating, and that means that it will become more difficult to have access to the capital market. It is also where climate change is still there, and we see that the impact of climate change are becoming more and more visible. You can think about the summer in Belgium, but more broadly, we see clearly an increase in extreme weather events, the difficult energy transition in the context where Russia might decide to cut energy delivery to Europe, and where Europe is also putting additional sanctions in place that are also aimed at reducing its energy reliance on Russia. And of course, it will come with consequences on the Eurozone economy. And in a context where the geopolitical tensions are important, as well as the trade tension and social tension. So what is the impact in terms of rating? Whereas Credendo downgraded a lot of business environment rating in 2020, we did some upgrade in 2021. And the trend this year is slightly positive. Why slightly positive? If you look at what I said before, it was quite negative. It's just because given all the downgrade that we did in 2020, you have still some countries like in Latin America that are performing relatively well, and for which we are able to upgrade our business environment rating. For all the CIS there, we are in a very negative category, or we already downgraded them at the beginning of the year. For the short-term political risk, there the trend is clearly negative because we downgraded our rating for Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, of course, but also for neighboring countries, Georgia and Moldova, because we think that if there is an extension of the war outside Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova are likely to be the next one. We did also on the upside some upgrades, mainly in Latin America, that is still performing relatively well because some countries see improvement of the tourism revenue and others are benefiting from higher commodity prices, which is also, for instance, the case of Oman and Zambia that you see there on the list. For the MLT political risk, so that provide an idea about the solvency of the country, there since a few years, we have much more downgrade than upgrade. If you look at 2016, the downgrade was largely explained by the fall in commodity prices. In 2019, we did a number of downgrades in order to prepare to what we were expecting then, an increase in interest rate and so deterioration of the global financial condition. Didn't happen, but that means that now we are well prepared in terms of rating to face a deterioration of the global financial condition. Then in 2020 and 2021, you had the impact on the COVID. And 2022, if you see the list of downgrade, you have, of course, the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also the ongoing crisis, liquidity and solvency crisis in Sri Lanka. On the upside, we upgraded Brazil, Guyana, and Oman. They are all commodity exporters, and Guyana benefits really from the fact that they discover huge oil reserves. So what is our impact, because that's the main topic of today, on the Credendo cover policy on Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. Here you see on the map our MLT political risk classification, so that provides an idea about the solvency. You see that we are in the highest risk category for Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine in category 7. And for Russia, we are off cover. That is explained by various factors. The first one is the EU sanctions that are in place that prohibit to provide public financing or financial support for trade with or investment in Russia. There are some exceptions that are related to food and medicine. But despite this exception, we decide to go fully off cover because you have all the Western sanctions and the Russian counter sanctions that are in place. For instance, Russia puts gradually more and more counter sanctions, and our expectation is that given we see no side in the conflict, we see no end in the conflict inside, our expectation is that Russia will continue to put in place some counter sanctions that will impede the payment between Russia and the West, and it is therefore that we are very prudent, even for the exceptions that are allowed by the EU sanction. Moreover, you still have the risk to have further tightening of sanctions, also from the EU side. Very recently, the EU is discussing about putting also Sberbank on the list of countries, on banks that are not able to access SWIFT, and we see a sharp deterioration of the economic condition in Russia. When looking at Belarus, there also we are off cover for both short-term and MLT transactions. You have all the sanctions that are in place. Some sanctions target notably the banking sector and also key export products like the potash. That is also a key ingredient to make fertilizer. And of course, it is also adding to the food crisis. You have also risk of having further sanctions imposed by Belarusian or the Belarusian authority or by the EU. And again, it is a country where we saw a sharp deterioration of the economic activity is ongoing. For Ukraine, we are also off cover for short-term and MLT transaction. It is because, of course, you have the ongoing war in Ukraine, but also because the authorities put in place a martial law where cross-border payments are impeded by this law because you need to have a permission by the central bank to be able to perform cross-border payment. That's really the logical also why we are off cover on all those countries. So that's for our cover policy. I thank you for your attention. If you have any question, you have here some contact detail. You can always contact me for any question on Belarus, Russia, or other countries, as well as my colleagues. If you have any question related to how Credendo might help you, or what are the products that we offer, etc. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pascaline. Thank you very much. We will hold on to the positive points in your presentation. Yes, let's see you in the Q&A when we are finished with the other presentation. Thank you very much, Pascaline. Bye. Next speaker is Grégory Claude from FPS Foreign Affairs. He is going to talk about the existing trade barriers in Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And he is going to remind you of our toolbox to bring down the barriers to trade. The European Commission, the EU member states, and the European industry, they work continuously together to overcome commercial trade barriers introduced by third countries. Grégory Claude of the FPS Federal Public Service will explain how this is rolled out in practice and will address more specifically the commercial barriers set up by Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. Mr. Claude will give his presentation in French. Grégory, n'hésite pas à prendre la parole.
Merci, Katrien. Est-ce que tu m'entends? Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien?
Super.
Merci.
Parfait.
Je ne t'en veux pas, hein, Katrien, mais je travaille au service public économie. Non, mais c'est pas grave, et pas les affaires étrangères. Cela dit, je dois dire qu'on collabore très, très étroitement avec les affaires étrangères, je dirais presque main dans la main. C'est pourquoi parfois on peut faire pas l'erreur, mais en tout cas la petite faute. Mais
nous rencontrons toujours au sein de Market Access Advisory Committee préparatoire, et c'est en fait, oui, c'est vrai, avec
les affaires étrangères.
Voilà, c'est pour ça que j'ai fait une erreur.
Mais c'est aucun souci, mais c'était
bien que vous avez éclairé. Voilà.
Aucun problème, c'est juste pour oui, me présenter très rapidement. Donc, je m'appelle Grégory Claude et je travaille effectivement au SPF Économie dans le service commerce et investissements internationaux. Et moi, plus particulièrement, je représente régulièrement la Belgique auprès du Conseil, de l'UE et de la Commission européenne lorsqu'il s'agit tantôt de concevoir des règlements européens en matière de commerce, ou alors tantôt d'appliquer certains règlements européens en matière de commerce, parce que nous n'avons pas tous les règlements commerce sous notre responsabilité, mais certains. Il y en a notamment un que je vais un peu parler aujourd'hui. Malheureusement, vu le temps que j'ai, je ne vais pas pouvoir rentrer dans tous les détails. Je vais vous parler donc de la lutte contre les obstacles au commerce dressés par les pays tiers. Et pendant la présentation, vous verrez certainement certains dossiers concrets qui sont abordés, en tout cas suivis par la Belgique auprès de l'UE, surtout auprès de la Commission. Et on ne va pas rentrer dans tous les détails de ces dossiers, vous comprenez bien, vu le temps que nous avons, mais en tout cas, vous les aurez, vous pourrez avoir un aperçu de quelques-uns de ces dossiers, et particulièrement les dossiers, les obstacles au commerce qui sont dressés, initiés par la Russie, le Belarus et l'Ukraine. Donc, ça c'est la structure de la présentation, donc je vais vous donner quelques chiffres récents sur les obstacles. Je vous parlerai d'un instrument, ce n'est pas un instrument législatif, mais c'est un instrument quand même très important en matière de lutte contre les obstacles au commerce, qui est la stratégie d'accès au marché des pays tiers. Ce n'est pas un règlement ici, c'est plutôt une méthode de travail entre la Commission, les États membres et l'industrie européenne. Ensuite, quelques mots aussi sur, là c'est un vrai règlement européen qui s'appelle le Trade Barrier Regulation. C'est un des seuls règlements européens qui permet, je dirais, aux stakeholders, aux entreprises, aux fédérations et même aux États membres de déposer une plainte lorsqu'ils sont confrontés à un obstacle au commerce. Ensuite, puisque c'est un peu le thème général de la session aujourd'hui, je vous donnerai aussi un aperçu des cas, en tout cas des obstacles Bélarus, Russes et Ukraine qui sont suivis dans un comité de la Commission qui s'appelle Market Access Advisory Committee. On prend souvent l'acronyme MAC pour en parler. Donc ici, je vous ai préparé une slide avec quelques informations, quelques chiffres sur les obstacles au commerce en général, en tout cas les obstacles au commerce qui affectent l'Union européenne. Je ne vais pas rentrer dans tous les détails de cette slide, mais en tout cas, si vous, entreprises, fédérations, citoyens, enfin je ne sais pas qui est intéressé par les obstacles au commerce, par la lutte contre les obstacles au commerce, il faut savoir que la Commission européenne, chaque année, publie un rapport d'activité qui détaille un petit peu les activités en matière de lutte contre les obstacles au commerce. Voilà, ici, le seul que nous avons aujourd'hui, c'est le rapport d'activité qui couvre l'année 2020. Donc, on n'a pas encore le rapport d'activité qui couvre l'année 2021. Ça va arriver dans quelques mois, je ne sais pas exactement. Mais tout ce que nous avons aujourd'hui, c'est un peu l'état des lieux de ce qui s'est passé en 2020. Grâce à ce rapport qui s'appelle le Implementation Enforcement Report de la Commission qu'elle envoie au Parlement européen et au Conseil. Vous voyez que, par exemple, ici, rapidement, que fin 2020, il y avait 462 obstacles actifs suivis par les États membres, la Commission européenne et l'industrie de l'Union européenne dans 66 pays. Tous ces obstacles sont en fait regroupés dans une base de données qui s'appelle la MADB, mais maintenant on parle plutôt du système Access to Markets, où en fait tout un chacun, vous pouvez aller consulter cette base de données et voir un petit peu quels sont ces différents obstacles, ces 462 obstacles. Peut-être que maintenant il y en a plus, hein, vu qu'on est déjà en 2022, où il y en a moins, bon, il faudra voir. Ça c'est une constante chaque année. Parmi les pays les plus problématiques, en tout cas qui affectent les exportations européennes et aussi belges, vous avez, enfin ce ne sera sans doute pas une surprise, la Chine, la Russie, l'Indonésie, les USA, l'Inde, la Turquie, c'est des pays extrêmement problématiques. Ce sont des gros partenaires de l'Union européenne, aussi de la Belgique, et ils sont assez problématiques en matière d'accès au marché. Il y a beaucoup d'obstacles au marché, il y a différents types d'obstacles. Voilà, il y a les mesures phytosanitaires et phytosanitaires, on parle des mesures SPS, il y a les obstacles techniques, il y a d'autres mesures, il y a des restrictions au marché public, il y a des taxes, enfin voilà. Pour terminer avec cette slide, la lutte contre les obstacles au commerce et tous les efforts qui ont été faits par les États membres, la Commission, l'industrie, permettent de générer chaque année pas mal d'argent de gains. Donc, ça veut dire que on a fait sauter, on a éliminé des obstacles, on élimine chaque année des obstacles, et ça permet chaque année de générer des milliards d'euros supplémentaires d'exportation pour les entreprises de l'Union européenne. Donc, je vous invite, si ça vous intéresse, à creuser peut-être et aller une fois jeter un œil sur ces rapports qui s'appellent Implementation and Enforcement. Voilà pour les chiffres. Maintenant, comme je vous disais tout à l'heure, un autre outil non législatif, mais très, très important, qui est vraiment le fondement de l'activité de la coopération entre la Commission, États membres et l'industrie. C'est ce qui s'appelle la stratégie d'accès au marché des pays tiers. Ce n'est pas un concept qui est nouveau, c'est un concept qui existe depuis de très nombreuses années. C'est une méthode de travail entre les trois acteurs dont je viens vous parler. On s'est mis d'accord on a choisi une méthode de travail pour lutter efficacement contre les obstacles au commerce. Et cette stratégie, en fait, elle est composée de deux grands piliers, deux grands instruments, si vous voulez. Il y a ce qu'on appelle le partnership, le partenariat entre les États membres, la Commission et l'industrie. Voilà, c'est une méthode de coopération, en résumé, entre ces trois acteurs pour pouvoir éliminer les obstacles au commerce et surtout se coordonner. Donc, on a besoin d'une méthode de coordination pour savoir, quand on est face à un obstacle au commerce dressé par la Russie, en tout cas avant le conflit, surtout, savoir qu'est-ce qu'on va faire, comment se coordonner et être efficace pour justement traiter l'obstacle et dans l'espoir de le faire sauter. Il faut savoir que lever des obstacles au commerce, ce n'est pas un sprint, c'est plutôt une course de fond. Donc, parfois, c'est des dossiers qui durent des dizaines d'années, avec énormément de pression qui est mise sur les pays tiers et d'explications aussi pour finalement avoir... il faut avoir le temps pour finalement les convaincre à supprimer l'obstacle ou alors simplement modifier la façon dont ils appliquent, pas appliquer l'obstacle, mais l'obstacle, en fait, ce sont des procédures, des règlements, des circulaires, des décrets, des lois, etc., en matière de commerce qui, quand elles sont appliquées, parfois pour des raisons très légitimes, mais c'est la façon dont elles sont appliquées par les autorités douanières, par exemple, qui cause un problème. Donc, simplement, pas supprimer la loi, mais changer la façon dont elle est appliquée pour justement lever l'obstacle au commerce. Donc, il y a le partenariat, ça c'est la méthode de coopération entre les États membres. On collabore aussi à travers un comité où on se rencontre tous. Donc, il y a les États membres, la Commission et l'industrie européenne se réunissent ensemble dans un comité pour justement décider, parler des obstacles et décider de ce qu'on va faire. Il y a un autre système, l'autre instrument sur lequel repose la stratégie, c'est ce qu'on appelle le système Access to Markets. On en a parlé tout à l'heure, peut-être que certains d'entre vous connaissent cet outil. C'est là où vous trouvez les obstacles au commerce. Vous pouvez les consulter les détails, etc. Mais surtout, très important, et c'est là-dessus que je veux insister aujourd'hui, c'est que vous trouverez un formulaire de plainte. Depuis pas très longtemps, il y a maintenant un formulaire de plainte que les entreprises peuvent utiliser pour notifier, signifier un obstacle au commerce auprès de la Commission européenne. Ce qui n'est pas encore prévu actuellement, c'est que les États membres concernés, donc si c'est une entreprise belge qui dépose plainte, moi, qui représente la Belgique au Market Access Advisory Committee, je ne vais pas spécialement être notifié. Donc, ce n'est pas prévu dans le système, c'est une lacune, entre guillemets. Et donc, ce que je veux faire passer comme message, c'est que si vous déposez plainte via ce système, on vous demande, on vous invite, si vous voulez, vous n'êtes pas obligé, à nous envoyer une copie de votre plainte, parce que sinon, on risque de ne pas être au courant. Pas toujours au courant. Voilà, vous avez ici l'adresse trade.info@economique.gov.be pour les questions, pour les copies de plainte, pour nous contacter. Donc, très rapidement, oui, ici, c'était le schéma du partenariat. Donc, c'est de la méthode de travail avec méthode de coordination entre États membres, Commission et industrie, où on voit ici en fait que ça repose sur des flux d'informations entre différents acteurs positionnés dans différentes régions, donc à Bruxelles, hein, où se fait les réunions européennes, mais aussi en lien avec tout le travail et énorme travail qui est réalisé au niveau des pays tiers même, donc des ambassades, des postes diplomatiques. En Belgique, il y a aussi les régions qui sont sur place, en tout cas dans certains pays, pour traiter directement l'obstacle au commerce, parce qu'ils ont ils ont parfois plus facile de rentrer en contact avec les autorités sur place, et parfois l'obstacle, le problème peut se régler comme ça aussi. Si c'est un gros problème structurel, alors il faut définir peut-être des stratégies plus importantes, et alors on passe plutôt du côté de Bruxelles, où il faut, je ne sais pas moi, mobiliser le commissaire européen au commerce ou le commissaire à l'agriculture, etc. Donc voilà, ça c'est un peu globalement le flux d'informations qui circule entre les différents acteurs, et c'est ça le partenariat. Voilà, donc je vais pas m'appesantir trop sur ça c'est le Market Access Advisory Committee qui fait partie du partenariat. J'en ai parlé un petit peu, il regroupe commission, États membres, fédération, ne concerne pas des actes législatifs, mais plutôt des stratégies comme des lettres. On va envoyer des lettres, on va prendre des contacts diplomatiques, on va faire des réunions, voilà, il y a différentes choses. Ce comité, donc, il traite des obstacles au commerce rencontrés par les opérateurs de l'UE. En 2021, voilà, il a abordé 174 mesures dans 33 pays tiers différents. Et les pays problématiques, l'année passée, c'était la Chine, l'Égypte, l'Inde, la Turquie et les USA. En tout cas, ce sont les pays dont on a discuté l'année passée. Dans ce comité, la Belgique est représentée par le SPF Économie, c'est-à-dire moi, et aussi avec un collègue des affaires étrangères. Toujours les deux ministères présents à ce comité. Et donc, nous défendons, si nous avons des informations qui sont communiquées par les entreprises, qui sont communiquées par les postes, nous pouvons, disons, défendre les intérêts belges dans ce comité et attirer l'attention de la Commission sur ces problèmes belges en particulier. Il faut pour ça qu'on reçoive des inputs. Voilà, ça c'était un peu le schéma du partenariat, mais avec la dimension Belgique, acteurs belges insérés dans le partenariat, où il y a aussi des flux d'informations qui circulent entre les entreprises et les fédérations belges, entre les fédérations belges et le SPF Économie, puisqu'on les consulte avant chaque réunion du Market Access Advisory Committee, entre par exemple les ambassades et le service affaires étrangères, parce que c'est lui qui coordonne ces inputs-là. Alors, pour suivre tous ces dossiers, parce qu'il y a énormément de dossiers chaque année qui est suivi au Market Access Advisory Committee, nous avons mis en place déjà depuis un certain temps une grande liste de plus de 600 dossiers, parce que, comme je vous ai dit, ce sont des dossiers parfois qui durent voilà, 1 an, mais parfois c'est des dossiers qui durent 10 ans. Alors, c'est intéressant d'avoir quand même un aperçu rapide des dossiers. Est-ce qu'il y a des intérêts belges dans ces dossiers? C'est ça. C'est pour cela qu'on les surligne en jaune dans le tableau, et les dates des comités, des Market Access Advisory Committee, quand la date est mise en gras et soulignée, ça veut dire que nous, la Belgique, on a dit quelque chose lors de ces comités. Ça permet assez rapidement, quand on reçoit l'agenda du comité, voilà, on ne sait jamais ce qu'il va y avoir à l'agenda. Voilà, on peut parler tout d'un coup de l'Afrique du Sud. Eh bien, c'est assez facile d'aller voir la fiche de l'Afrique du Sud et voir un peu quels étaient par le passé les intérêts belges, donc en jaune, et qu'est-ce qu'on a dit et quand on l'a dit aussi. C'est un peu, sans ça, c'est assez difficile de gérer ces dossiers qui s'étalent, comme je l'ai dit, sur plusieurs années. Alors maintenant, très rapidement, sur l'outil législatif dont on dispose les entreprises européennes, belges, les fédérations, les États membres, c'est le Trade Barrier Regulation, c'est un règlement européen. C'est le règlement de 2015-1843 du 6 octobre 2015. Donc, c'est un comité de la Commission. C'est un règlement qui peut être utilisé par une entreprise pour déposer une plainte formelle auprès de la Commission européenne et qui invite la Commission européenne à lancer une procédure TBR, Trade Barrier Regulation, qui consiste à en fait, à faire sauter l'obstacle, et la Commission va devoir prendre contact avec le pays tiers, négocier avec lui la fin de l'obstacle au commerce, et si ça n'aboutit pas, il se peut que l'Union européenne porte le dossier à l'OMC, à l'organe de règlement des différends, pour avoir alors un dispute settlement au niveau de l'OMC et essayer que l'obstacle disparaisse après cette procédure. C'est une procédure qui est très très longue. Je dois dire que je vous invite, si possible, à faire la promotion de ce règlement, parce que c'est un règlement qui n'est pas très connu et qui n'est pas fort utilisé non plus. Cela dit, dernièrement, quand on l'a utilisé, l'obstacle a toujours été levé. Donc, c'est quand même important. Cela dit, c'est assez difficile pour une entreprise toute seule, et certainement pas une PME, par exemple, de toute seule déposer une plainte via ce règlement parce que ça prend du temps, ça coûte cher, etc. etc. À mon avis, le mieux à faire, c'est quand une entreprise pense qu'on pourrait utiliser ce règlement, c'est d'essayer de s'allier peut-être à d'autres entreprises ou peut-être demander à une fédération belge de le faire ou même une fédération européenne de le faire, qui a plus de moyens, qui peut collecter des informations qui viennent de plusieurs États membres pour avoir plus de poids pour déposer une plainte. Donc la Belgique est représentée dans ce comité par le SPF Économie, moi-même, j'y vais régulièrement, et également les collègues des affaires étrangères, ce sont les mêmes. Donc, il y a 3 affaires récentes pour ce règlement. En 2017, il y a eu le Uncoated Wood Free Paper. L'obstacle a été de la Turquie. Et l'obstacle a été levé. Donc, la procédure a été profitable pour l'industrie européenne. Il y a eu un cas avec la tequila, les export restrictions de tequila. C'est un cas qui a été réglé aussi. Et qui est fini. Et il y a les carreaux en céramique de l'Arabie saoudite. Ici, ce n'est pas terminé. L'Arabie saoudite s'est engagée à modifier, à adapter ses règlements pour qu'il n'y ait plus le problème, l'obstacle au commerce. Voilà. Ici, maintenant, on est dans une phase de monitoring. La décision n'a pas encore été prise de clôturer la procédure, mais voilà, si l'Arabie saoudite respecte ces engagements, il ne devrait pas y avoir de problème. Voilà. Je vous ai mis quelques liens utiles pour creuser un petit peu les obstacles au commerce. Aussi un article qui a été rédigé par notre service qui explique un peu tout ça dans le carrefour de l'économie, Treffpunkt Économie, numéro 25. Voilà, maintenant, j'espère qu'il me reste... Je crois qu'il ne me reste plus énormément de temps, mais je vais passer à l'aperçu des obstacles au Bélarus, en Russie et en Ukraine, qui sont suivis au comité d'accès au marché par la Belgique et par l'Union européenne depuis 2014. Et ce jusqu'au début du conflit, donc en février de cette année. Donc, voilà, la liste que je vais vous montrer, c'est une liste indicative. Elle n'a pas la prétention de reprendre absolument tous les obstacles au commerce qui existent avec ces pays-là, mais en tout cas, ce sont les dossiers qui ont été à un moment donné suivis depuis 2014 au Market Access Advisory Committee. Donc, pour ces 3 pays, on rencontre surtout des mesures sanitaires et phytosanitaires, des interdictions, import ban, export ban, des obstacles techniques, des restrictions appliquées au marché public, des taxes discriminatoires, des problèmes douaniers. Donc, ce sont les mesures que l'on rencontre le plus souvent avec ces pays-là. Et pour quels produits? Surtout des produits agricoles, agroalimentaires, des produits du bois, des produits pharmaceutiques, des minéraux, du matériel de transport. Je ne suis pas en train de vous dire que ce sont ces produits-là qui sont le plus exportés vers ces pays-là. Ce n'est pas ce que je veux dire. Ce que je veux dire, c'est que ce sont les produits qui ont été frappés d'obstacles au commerce qui sont dedans. Hein. Je ne suis pas en train de parler de qui exporte, quel produit est exporté le plus. Alors, pour le Bélarus, vous voyez qu'en tout cas, en Belgique, on n'a pas eu énormément de problèmes avec d'exportation vers le Bélarus, puisque vous voyez qu'il n'y a qu'un seul dossier qui est surligné en jaune. Donc là, ça veut dire que des intérêts belges, à un moment donné, ont été détectés, et c'était pour des problèmes SPS, voilà, African Swine Fever, par exemple, la fièvre porcine africaine, et qui concernait différents produits alimentaires ou produits d'agriculture, voilà, les pigs, les pommes de terre. Donc, pour les autres barrières que vous voyez ici, ça a été soulevé par d'autres États membres qui avaient des préoccupations, mais nous, ici en Belgique, enfin, à notre niveau, on n'a pas été, mis à part les porcs ou les produits du porc, on n'a pas été informé de problèmes avec ces autres barrières, ce qui ne veut pas dire qu'il n'y en a pas, mais en tout cas, nous, on ne le sait pas. Donc, on n'a pas eu de signaux. Alors, il n'y a pas beaucoup de... Pour le Bélarus, il y a 7 obstacles actifs, ce n'est pas beaucoup, mais pour la Russie, c'est beaucoup plus. Beaucoup plus de dossiers sont arrivés au Market Access Advisory Committee. Il y a 25 obstacles actifs, encore actifs. Et pour l'Ukraine, c'est 15, donc c'est un peu moins. Donc pour la Russie, comme vous le savez sûrement, nos produits agroalimentaires et agricoles ont été touchés par un embargo politique il y a quelques années. Ça faisait suite au dossier avec la Crimée. Et cet embargo politique nous a touchés beaucoup en Belgique. Hein. Tout le monde connaît l'histoire des pommes et des poires et d'autres produits. Donc, l'embargo politique nous a impacté en Belgique. Et il y en a d'autres, hein, les transit restrictions. On voit que le dossier a été résolu en 2020. Donc, en principe, pour nous, c'est bon. Des mesures phytosanitaires et sanitaires, encore une fois, avec la Russie, beaucoup de problèmes pour différents produits, le porc, les patates, voilà, la viande. On est intervenu beaucoup pour l'African Swine Fever, l'embargo sanitaire qui avait été imposé par la Russie aussi en 2014. Le bois, ce n'est pas une surprise non plus pour le ban on export of unprocessed coniferous roundwood, qui a aussi impacté la Belgique et qui est toujours suivi d'ailleurs au Market Access Advisory Committee. En tout cas, jusqu'au conflit. Voilà, il y avait des restrictions aux achats faits par des entreprises détenues par l'État. Les produits pharmaceutiques en Belgique, c'est très important. Donc, les dossiers, les barrières qui affectent nos produits pharmaceutiques, c'est très important pour nous et on les suit bien sûr. Et un dernier, le fameux système d'étiquetage et de traçabilité russe. Ça aussi, c'est quelque chose qui nous a préoccupés depuis, en tout cas, 2019. Alors, pour l'Ukraine, il n'y a pas énormément d'intérêts belges qui ont été détectés, pas de dossier où on a eu des intérêts belges. Pour l'Ukraine, on a aussi en tout cas, comme les deux autres pays, des problèmes SPS, hein, pour le pet food par exemple, la viande de volaille, le porc aussi. Là, c'était résolu pour le porc en Ukraine. Voilà, et pour terminer, j'espère qu'il me reste encore quelques minutes, ici, donc j'ai parlé ici des mesures qu'on suivait pour l'Ukraine, Bélarus et Russie jusqu'au conflit, mais après le conflit, il y a eu aussi différentes mesures qui ont été prises par le Bélarus, Russie et Ukraine, et ici j'essaie de les compiler. Donc depuis le début du conflit, il y a eu principalement pour le Bélarus et la Russie des export bans de différents produits, souvent pendant 6 mois ou jusqu'à la fin de l'année ici 2022, hein, en tout cas pour le moment, et qui concerne pour le Bélarus des céréales. Voilà, c'est à partir de mars 2022, Cet export ban a été élargi aux grains utilisés dans l'alimentation animale. Il y a eu une export ban sur certains types de produits industriels, apparemment 254 types de produits. Et je vous avoue que c'est un peu difficile à trouver le texte. Je suis toujours en train d'essayer de trouver le texte qui précise ces 254 types de produits. Pour la Russie, également des export bans à partir de mars 2022, le décret 311 qui impose une export ban sur 200 produits, toutes sortes de produits technologiques, télécoms, turbines, des projecteurs, des machines agricoles, voilà, export ban ici jusqu'à la fin de cette année. Et un autre décret, le 313, qui concerne certains types de bois, aussi jusqu'à la fin de l'année. Il y en a d'autres, mais là, très rapidement, export ban sur le grain, le céréales, et aussi le sucre, apparemment jusqu'en juin. Export ban aussi sur les ammonium fertiliseurs, jusqu'en juin. Également les huiles, oil and oilseeds, des quotas, des interdictions temporaires, et également des droits supplémentaires qui ont augmenté. Voilà je suis arrivé à la fin de la présentation. J'espère que je n'ai pas été trop long et je rends la parole à Katrien, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting to see a display of all the barriers, and thank you very much for enlightening us with the toolbox to tackle these trade barriers. May I insist to all the companies that are following this webinar to contact FPS Économie, Monsieur Claude, pour leur informer des barrières qu'ils vivent avec des autres pays. Next speaker is our Didier De Baere. He is our current Deputy Director General of the BFTA. In his early career, Didier was delegated by the National Bank of Belgium to the EU-Council Sanctions Committee, where he witnessed how sanctions are negotiated between the EU member states, the decision process, and the enforcement of such sanctions. With this knowledge, he later specialized in assisting companies with claims on political risk countries, mostly caused by economical and financial embargoes. He will start to give you an overview of the various existing sanction regimes, their consequences on a commercial level, and conclude with giving you some tricks how to safeguard your rights in the best way with a focus on Russia. Didier, enlighten us with your contribution.
Thank you, Katrien. And indeed, I'm playing a home game today. But as you said, in my earlier career, I had the opportunity to witness from close range how effective financial and economic sanctions can be as a trade barrier. And most of our companies are PMEs. And when you have a successful, or SMEs, when you have a successful small or medium-sized company and business is getting better and better, and all of a sudden you have the chance to start exporting, sanctions are not necessarily the first thing what you're thinking of, although it is important. Allow me to share you the world map, and you will see on how many countries restrictions are applied, and it's quite considerable, and we do not always realize that. So it is something to take into account, and something that we should realize and study, or at least get a look how those sanctions could affect your business. Now, I'm not going to give a big historical lecture on sanction regimes, but sanction regimes have existed for nearly always. When two countries went to war, it goes without saying that they wanted to obstruct one another in the best possible way, and that they also had limitations on trade, and they not only with arms, but they also tried to destroy each other economically. Now that changed a little bit during the 20th century when, for instance, in the fallout of the Yom Kippur War in Israel, where Arab nations all of a sudden closed down the oil pipelines towards Western Europe. And that was about the first time when we saw a coordinated action, not yet institutionalized, but which was effective and which had enormous consequences on Western countries. We all might remember the old days of carless Sundays, and we did it a little bit in the other way around in the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in 1978 in Iran. But that was all not yet institutionalized. That changed in 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and for the first time, the United Nations Security Council made an application of its Chapter 7, which allows it to take restrictive measures, and where there was a full agreement to install a complete economic and financial sanction regime against Saddam Hussein's regime. Now, let's start. What are the various bases for those sanctions? Well, I already mentioned the United Nations Security Council Chapter 7 possibilities. It was a little bit, during a certain amount of time, it was a little bit of a hybrid situation. United Nations decisions, especially from the General Assembly, they don't have a direct legal application in Belgium or in Europe. But when it concerns a decision by the Security Council, they might be considered as some kind of imperative law, which is called in international law jus cogens, which means you should follow it, you should be aware of it. So the Belgian legislator realized that an intervention was necessary to make UN Council resolutions applicable in Belgium, and therefore he introduced the law of 11 May 1995. That is the legal basis, and then with royal decrees or ministerial decrees, we can execute those measures taken by the United Nations Security Council in Belgium. Nowadays, most important sanctions still active is the ones against Libya, where there are some heavy restrictions on delivery of certain products, especially arms related and so on. You will see on top of this first slide that the SPF Finances has a quite comprehensive overview where you can see the various kind of sanctions which are possible and what the precise content is. If you start exporting and you see on that big map, which I showed earlier, that this country has some restrictions, it is always useful to follow that. The direct application of sanctions without a necessary intervention from the Belgian legislator is, of course, the European Council resolutions. And there, the most important countries affected by it are Syria and Russia. There is a possibility that Belgium would take further execution measures, but most of the time it is not necessary, and Belgian measures limit themselves to the freezing of funds of people who are considered here to be sponsors of terrorism. So the European Council resolutions on Syria and Russia, and we will go more deeply into that, Those are the most two important ones we know from the European Council. And then a third kind of sanction is actually one which is not institutionalized, but which is a side effect of the extraterritorial execution of American sanctions, and which has to do with the use of US dollars especially. Now, if we look at the various kind of sanctions, sometimes, as I said, it's limited. It has to do with that there are some limitations on the export of arms-related goods. Now, you might think as a Belgian exporter, well, I'm not affected, I'm not producing arms, so for me there is no problem to export to a country like Yemen or Myanmar. There you have to be careful. There is this huge issue of dual-use goods. And you might think, well, my product cannot be used in any arms-related operations or military-related operations, but you have to be very careful with that. That list can be very extensive. To give a concrete example, there is this case of AkzoNobel in the Netherlands, who decided to export to Iraq in the time some base products for producing paints. They didn't see any problem, but they forgot that their base product for paint could also be used as a chemical weapon. So these product restrictions are scrutinized quite heavily. Today's examples are countries like Yemen, Libya, Myanmar, and Sudan. And before you start exporting those goods to the targeted countries, do not forget to ask for a permit. And that permit is in Belgium, the complete competence of the regions. So if you are a company located in the Flemish part of the country, you need to ask the Flemish government for a permit to export that product. The problem with sanctions is that if you do forget about this and you have exported it and the product passed customs, it remains your responsibility. So you are liable in case you have this, and let's go back to the example of AkzoNobel. If you start exporting base products for paint, you don't see any problem, but you forgot to ask for this permit. It remains the sole liability of the company that they did not ask for this permit. So do not forget that. There is also, and those are the most heavily ones, and I think it's fair to say that Russia is also falling in this area, the full-scale economic financial sanctions. And this means that the sanctions undertaken are so heavy that it becomes practically impossible to do any trade in a normal way with those countries anymore. Sometimes there are some exceptions when we are talking about foodstuff and medical related products where you can obtain an exception on the embargo and it can still be exported. The reason for that is that although the sanction wants to put the pressure as high as possible on the regimes they are targeting, there is some people do realize, our governments do realize that the local population should not be punished in a much too severe way. Some examples, it is still possible in a limited way to export to Syria, especially for the non-regime controlled area in the north. But be careful, whereas if I go back to the previous slide, where you should ask for a permit and there is a possibility to export other goods which are not falling under the scope of dual use products, Here, it's the other way around. You need to ask for a permit beforehand, and it's only for a limited amount of or a limited scale of products that export is still possible. What you do need to take into account is that controls on such exports to countries like Syria, North Korea, Russia, that they are very strict, and that you, in case you would find it necessary still to deal with those countries, that repercussions could be extremely high, even with imprisonment of company leaders or company owners. As I already said, there is a special case, and this is especially for us now. It's especially with Iran. There is this special case of sanction, which is not an institutionalized sanction, but a de facto sanction regime, which has to do with the Helms-Burton Act of the United States. The Helms-Burton Act, quite specifically, says that anyone complicit in trading with a targeted country will be punishable under US law, and they take it extremely far. This is controlled by OFAC, and OFAC is very severe in approaching this. To be concrete, Iran, we do not have extreme high sanction regime against Iran. There are only two restrictions. You cannot export military equipment, and you cannot export any material which has to do with atomic energy. Now, in all other cases, as a Belgian company, you would be allowed to trade with Iran. Problem solved, one might think, but this is unfortunately not the case. If you are dealing, for instance, in food-related export, you want to export chocolate to Iran, you don't see any problem. You have a good Iranian counterpart. They want to buy your product. You want to ship it. There is no problem. The big problem is, how will you get your money? Now, the Iranian bank might say to you, well, there is no problem. I will pay you in euro, but you will still need a European bank which will receive the money which is sent to you by the Iranian importer. Now, that's where the problem arises, because your bank is also dealing in US dollars. And because of the Helms-Burton Act, if that bank is dealing in US dollars, the US might consider your bank as a complicit one to enabling trade with Iran, whereas Iran is on the severe sanction regime by the US since Donald Trump overturned the agreement which was signed under the Obama administration. So your bank would no longer be able to conduct any business in the US. Your bank would risk criminal proceedings in the US, and your bank will not be willing to help you out in getting your payment. Another example is Cuba. This is alleviating because the US is also seeking to open up trade with Cuba, but very strictly speaking, it is still an issue. Be careful for that. There are not so many opportunities to circumvent this extraterritorial effect of US sanctions. Be careful, there are some possibilities, but be careful when you do it. You would not be in breach of any European law, but it might give you problems in the US. For instance, if you want to visit the US to visit some of your customers, or when you simply want to do it for a tourist visit, it is what happened to the big chief, and I think the story is known. It is what happened to the CEO of Huawei when she made a visit to Canada, and the US and Canada have an extradition treaty, when she was held in Canada over the fact that Huawei sent some mobile telephones to Iran. Now, what are repercussions for a company? What is the most common consequences that a company feels, an exporting company feels, when a sanction is imposed on the country which is it exporting to. And there, I think we can make it specifically for Russia. As of the 21st of February, we have the start of the war in Ukraine. The first set of sanctions was imposed on Russia by the European Union. Now, people that did not see it coming, or which were dealing with Russia under existing agreements, they might find themselves with block deliveries, and that can be a block delivery exporting wise, but also importing wise. The second problem that you might encounter is that you have a steady contract under which you have promised your importer in Russia to provide him on a monthly basis with a certain amount of your product, or the other way around, where you have committed yourself to take up a certain amount of commodities coming from Russia. And then a third problem is, of course, you already made the delivery, but you did that with a grace period of payment. So you made the delivery, let's say the 10th of February. Your customer had a 90 days period or 60 days period to pay the purchase price. And then because of the financial sanctions which were imposed on Russia, all of a sudden, the bank used by your Russian importer is on the sanctions list, and you cannot clear and the transfer of the monies to the European bank cannot be cleared anymore through the SWIFT system here in Belgium, or it simply has become impossible as a whole if you're dealing with a bank like VTB Bank, which was heavily assisting Russian companies for export. Same problem with bank guarantees and the same problem with letters of credit. It's quite common under UCP contract, which are the set of regulation for letters of credit, that the bank, to control the documents which should enable the payment, that there is a grace period of 30 to 60 days for that bank to make the check of the documents and then make the payment. If you made your delivery the 10th of February, the set of sanctions came in as of 21st of February, it is not possible anymore to obtain your payments. What can you do? And this is the most important and maybe the most interesting part of my contribution to this webinar. Well, first of all, there are the precaution measures, the preemptive measures that you can take. We had the luck to have Credendo here as the first speaker, and it's a little advice to exporting. If you start to export, or if you have exported to Russia and you have now problems, for the next time, let me use an English idiom, don't be penny wise, pound foolish. Credendo offers the possibility, when you are dealing with a political risk country or a country which might be in risk and which is a little bit in between, I would say, go for a credit insurance. It will cost you a little bit of money, but in case problems arise, then you are sure at least that you will not have any loss. If you have the normal 30% of profit margin or approximate 30% of profit margin on your product, you will get between 80 and 95% of your money back, and you don't make a loss. Another possibility is when you are working with letters of credit, to have the confirmation of your own bank. There again, you will pay a certain fee for that, and it will make things a little bit more expensive. But on the other hand, you are completely assured that in case of problems, that you will have your full amount of money, because your own bank has confirmed the letter of credit, and it's under the obligation of your bank then to pay you the purchase price. A third one, and this is the easiest one, it doesn't cost money. It is something you should take into account. When you make your contract with a foreign importer, people forget about it and they think, well, problems, it's the least of my worries, where in case of problems, where I should go for legal proceedings or arbitration proceedings. It is important, because when problems arise and you have to go to Russia to obtain a judgment or an arbitral award against your importer, it will be nearly impossible. It doesn't cost any money. It's not always the most difficult clause in a contract to change. At least if it's not possible to have Belgian jurisdiction clause, make sure it is kind of a neutral jurisdiction clause. Now, this is all preemptive, this is precautions, but what in case you did not do this and you now are faced with problems with Russia to obtain payments, or you have contract problems with your Russian importer? What can you do? Well, first of all, stay in touch with your clients. I mean, if your client is not one of the listed companies, or the CEO or the owner of the company is not a person which is on the list of targeted persons by the European Union, stay in touch with your client. Be honest to him. Tell him, in case you are forced to take action, tell him, I'm not doing this against you. What I'm doing is simply to safeguard my rights. Be open. In case he has a problem with it, explain to him that it might not be for enforcement immediately. It's just a safeguarding measure that you are taking. Ongoing deliveries, well, you have to be careful. I'm not directing anybody in doing something which is illegal, but you know that the measures taken against Russia are taken mainly by Western countries. It's not done by the whole world. Still yesterday, there was a big news item that India has bought an enormous amount of Russian oil at a very low price. In case you have this option and you are exporting as well to Russia as to Turkey, which has no sanctions from an economical point of view against Russia for the time being, I must say, is there something possible that you deal? You have to be careful. OECD regulations say that you have to know your customer, you have to know your end user. But if you fall within that scope, this might be a solution for your problem. And in case you have a claim, the only thing I can advise is go to court if you have a Belgian jurisdiction clause. If you have a neutral jurisdiction clause, take action as quickly as possible. And why is that? When you are confronted with a sanction-hit country, it is extremely difficult to have a recovery, especially when you delivered open account to your Russian importer, or if you did this in 2010, your Syrian importer. It is extremely difficult. The resources they have outside their country are quite often very limited, and it's a first come, first goes principle. If your importer has some monies in Western Europe, it will be very limited. It's the first one having a judgment that can take up the monies. If you are number 3 or number 4, it's quite likely that the account will be empty already. As I said, let your client know that you will undertake legal action. It is not a personal attack, but you need to do it. You need to have a judgment. Why? Well, not only because there is this first come, first goes principle, but secondly, most of the EU sanction, most of the United Nations sanctions, they have this article within the sanction regulation that says that in case you have an arbitral award, or in case you have a judgment against your debtor, your importer, and your transaction dates from before the establishment of the sanctions, that you can get an exemption on the embargo. In case you do find monies, you will be able to recover your money. Now, something else that people forget is quite often they only target their importer. Well, most of the time, when you have a letter of credit, do not forget a letter of credit, a bank guarantee, an active bank involvement is a separate liability from that bank towards you. Do not forget to not only to try to obtain a judgment or an arbitral award against your importer, but to also implicate the bank. Why? The reason is quite obvious. Even more than your importer, foreign banks will always have some accounts in Western Europe, and a Belgian judgment can easily be enforced in Germany. It can easily be enforced under the Brussels I regulation in France. So if you have that judgment, it gives you a number of opportunities to go to the correspondent banks where the guaranteeing bank of your importer has standing accounts, nostro vostro accounts or corresponding accounts, and that you get recovery from that accounts. This brings me to the end of my intervention, and I thank you all for participating to this webinar. Thank you. Katrien, back to you.
Thank you very much, Didier, for this presentation and your very hands-on tips and advice for companies that have been confronted with deliveries that cannot be paid or other instances of these kind of situations. So with this last presentation, we come to our Q&A section of this webinar. We have received a number of questions up front and during this webinar, which we will now try to address. A first question that we received, and I think this is directed to Didier. What about European companies having subsidiaries in Russia, owned by more than 50% from European companies and having bank accounts in Europe? Can we deal with them? If not, which arguments can we use in addition to the other arguments? They do not accept these arguments as these situations as force majeure, and it brings us in a conflictual situation. Do you understand the question? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a very good one. Now, the sanctions against Russia, for the time being, they are still in an evolving. In the beginning, it was quite limited. It's getting extended and extended and extended the whole time. Now there's indeed a very dangerous, in the last set of sanctions, there's a very dangerous one which says that you cannot export to any goods to Russia, which might help to develop the Russian industry. Now, this is, of course, a very broad concept. As for, so I believe that trade with Russia nowadays will become very difficult. The part of the question which concerns that it is a legal Russian entity, but it is controlled, or the majority of stakes is in hands of European countries. It remains a Russian legal entity, so it falls under the sanctions, which makes it clear, practically impossible to trade directly. And I repeat it once again, I cannot advise any company because they need to check whether it is possible or not. It's a little bit unclear how the European Union, what the stance of the European Union and the Belgian enforcement authorities, what their stance in this respect is. There are countries still dealing with Russia. If you are dealing also with those countries, does it open doors? It's an open question. I don't have the answer myself, but I do feel like direct trade with Russia will become extremely difficult, not only from a direct trading point of view, but especially from a point of view of getting paid. So for me, well, the thing about sanctions is, it is a political decision. It's like, if I'm a CEO of a company, I would like not to, I do not like to pay corporate tax, or I would like to pay less corporate tax, but it's a political decision that corporate tax is at a certain level. It's a political decision that says that we cannot deal with Russia anymore, or not at least in a very open way. So I think we have to accept that, and that's reality.
Thank you, Didier, for your answer. We have received some more questions. Like, what are the suggestions for payments with Russian customers? We have an affiliate in Russia. Can this affiliate, which is a registered company, work for banks under sanctions? I think you have answered these questions because they relate to the same topic. We have a question for Grégory. Mais je pense que cette question a été répondue pendant sa présentation. La question, c'était quelle est l'efficacité de l'utilisation du TBR. Et il semble que si c'est une avenue utile pour mobiliser l'action des pouvoirs publics, l'action est essentiellement politique, et si le pays tiers oppose un refus de baisser les barrières, n'est-ce pas beaucoup de temps et d'efforts perdus avant d'ensuite passer au contentieux? Quelle est la valeur ajoutée du TBR comparée à une action contentieuse bilatérale OMC? Donc, les entreprises ont besoin d'actions très rapides sur le terrain. C'est une question de M. Arnaud Van de Putte. Je passe à Grégory, mais je pense que cette question a été déjà abordée. Grégory, tu es là?
Oui, donc merci pour la question. Bon, la procédure TBR, peut-être que je n'ai pas expliqué, mais je pense que c'est dans le slide, elle est beaucoup plus rapide qu'une action devant l'OMC, parce qu'une action devant l'OMC, c'est, allez, je vais dire grosso modo 2 ans, tandis qu'une action TBR, c'est, attendez, je pense que c'est 12 mois. Je me demande un instant. Là. C'est vrai que je ne l'ai pas expliqué. Je pense que c'est 12 mois. Je pense que c'est 12 mois. Et ça peut, ça permet à la Commission d'aller négocier directement avec le pays tiers en question et essayer de trouver une solution rapide dans cette année. À vérifier, hein. Je pense que c'est 1 an. Je crois que je ne l'ai pas mis. Et si après, il faut aller à l'OMC, là, ce sont des consultations beaucoup plus longues. Hein. Vous savez qu'il y a toute une procédure, une longue procédure aussi à l'OMC, qui fait intervenir aussi les autres pays tiers. Et voilà, je crois que c'est un instrument qui permet d'aller plus vite et qui permet à la Commission de négocier directement avec le pays tiers, sans autre intervention. Et si malgré tout ça coince, et ici vous avez vu qu'il y a eu 3 cas récemment, ça n'a pas coincé, justement ça a réussi. Donc ça montre quand même que c'est un outil intéressant. Le seul problème de cet outil, c'est la préparation de la plainte, c'est ça prend du temps, c'est coûteux, et ça, c'est peut-être le plus grand frein dans l'instrument. C'est pour ça que la Commission préfère traiter la plupart des obstacles dans le cadre de la stratégie d'accès au marché. Là, c'est de la soft, c'est avec la soft diplomatie, les lettres, et alors maintenant, beaucoup, ça se traite dans les groupes de travail qui sont mis en place dans le cadre des accords commerciaux, avec aussi leur propre levier d'action pour faire tomber les barrières. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup pour votre clarification. C'est vrai qu'on aimerait tous faire un petit peu de sprints au lieu des longues procédures, mais donc c'est bien qu'on a des différents tools à utiliser avec des différents effets et des différentes stratégies. Donc, il faut les connaître et il faut les utiliser. On a encore reçu une question. We have received another question with more or less open questions from Mr. Vincent Lureau. He is a finance manager at the pipe rehabilitation sector in Belgium. And he asks us for some companies to let loose the Russian market due to the EU sanction has economic damage consequences, sometimes very important. For example, we sold goods who were authorized in February, but our customer payment reception has been blocked during weeks by the Finance Administration Treasury Compliance Department. The current situation is really uncertain, but does it mean like companies should forget for a while the Russian market? Another question, an open question, is there a way to execute sanctions against Russia without penalizing our European companies, which have already suffered from the COVID pandemic? Yes, these are a type of open questions. I wonder who is daring to answer this. Pascaline, I see you. I think that Didier has already, in his last, with his last slides, addressed the question: should we forget the Russian market for a while? Didier, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, indeed, it's the most safe way to proceed to forget about the Russian market for a while. It becomes extremely difficult, so that's the most safe way. But as I said, we cannot direct any company in doing whatsoever. It is unclear what the repercussions will be if you would do trade with Russia through a third market. It's unclear, it's unknown. I would not advise it, but I know that it's a possibility, and I know that some people are doing it. As for the question regarding the compliance check by the Belgian Treasury, it's their obligation. So they need to find out whether the payment was done for a correct transaction under the sanction regime installed. Will this take time? Yes, indeed. I think the same goes for goods which were in transit to Russia and which needed to undergo control by customs and excises. So it is indeed a little bit question mark and wait and see. So the safest way indeed is to forget about it.
Yes, it is. It was an open question, and we will, as I said in the beginning of this webinar, this is a process of change, and our companies need to be on point with the latest developments, and of course we all hope that we can return to a trading system that runs smoothly, and the first question, of course, return to peace, so that we don't need those sanctions in the first place. I have another question, but I think it will be best to answer it in private via mail. Yes, so with this last difficult question, we have come to the end of this webinar. We hope it was very informative for you and that you can use or apply some of the recommendations made by our speakers. Obviously, we understand that in the aftermath of this webinar, you might have some additional questions popping up or that you would require some more detailed information about your situation on a particular subject. As said, the presentations will be made available and they contain the contact details of the relevant persons. So do not hesitate to reach out directly to them if needed. All that is left for me is to thank you for your presence and participation today, which brings us to the end of this webinar. Thank you very much to all the panelists and the participants, and enjoy your day. Bye.